Hi class, this is Mr. Mitchell again, and today we'll be covering the settlement of the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. So basically we'll be covering the rest of the settlement of the English colonies outside the Chesapeake colonies, which were covered in the last lesson. Now, a lot of this might seem mundane, but there are many colonies in which the way that they were settled planted seeds for the future of our country. For example, you'll see a colony form a constitution for the first time, which of course our country is largely based on the constitution that the government adheres to today. You will see the precedent for religious freedom yet again being set, not only in Maryland like it was done beforehand, but more so and more widely in other colonies. So again, today we'll go through each one of the English colonies. Some will be very important when it comes to material later on. Basically, think of this lecture as planting the seeds for the American Revolution and the United States government that comes out of the American Revolution. This lecture is really divided into two, if you will, sub-lectures. The front side is going to be about the New England colonies, and we will talk about how they were largely settled for religious reasons, for various religious reasons, but religious reasons nonetheless. The back side of this lecture is going to talk about how the middle colonies were settled, especially Pennsylvania, and how the southern colonies were settled beyond the Chesapeake colonies, for example, the Carolinas and Georgia. Now, if you're looking at your notes right now, both sides of your notes should have a map on it. If it does not have a map on both sides, then there might be something wrong with the formatting. Maybe you should make sure that you download this as a Word document file. Otherwise, you may see problems moving forward. Another thing that you should be aware of is that whenever you look at these maps, you'll see some arrows that are pointing to different colonies on the maps. If you follow the arrows, they point to different boxes where I am talking about those different colonies, and I've made each arrow and its corresponding box a different style to kind of help you keep track of where we are at any given time. Okay, let's begin. So we talked about how there was a Reformation in England, and eventually you have the English Church break away during the English Protestant Reformation from the Catholic Church, and you have in its place, or a new church in England known as the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is sometimes called the Church of England. It's the same thing. There are going to be some people within this church, though, that felt like reforming the church by taking away the Pope and replacing the Pope with the King as the head of the church, that was just the beginning of reform, and that reform needed to go much further. These people were known as Puritans, and they were called so because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church. Many of them wanted to do this from within the church and fix things within the church. However, there were some that said to themselves that the church needed to be purified, but it could not be done within the Anglican Church. And these people were known as separatists. They felt like the Anglican Church was too corrupt. They felt like it needed to be reformed from the outside and basically abandoned and started over. The idea was scrap this church and we will worship as we see fit. And one of their other ideals was the idea of predestination, which is the idea that basically you are already predetermined if you're going to heaven or hell. And they did not exactly like the idea of sharing pews in the Anglican Church with those that were predestined to go to hell. That was another part of their ideology. There was a special group of these separatists that wanted to leave the church geographically, go somewhere else and start over, and you probably have heard of them. They were known as the Pilgrims. And these Pilgrims are going to ultimately sail, yes, on the Mayflower, like you probably learned in elementary school, to the New World in 1620. So in 1620, the Pilgrims are going to set sail on the Mayflower, the famous ship that you probably heard of long ago at a younger age. And they actually, unbeknownst to a lot of people, they were actually going towards Virginia. But on their way to Virginia, to join the Virginia Company and the Virginia Colony, they went off course. And in the end, they ended up hitting the Americas way farther north than they intended, hundreds of miles north of Virginia in what is now Massachusetts. And in their minds, this was a sign from God that they were supposed to start in Massachusetts. They landed in what is now Cape Cod, and they basically felt like they had been given a new piece of land outside of Virginia to worship as they saw fit. Now, before they got off of the boat, before they got off of the Mayflower, that is, the men of the group agreed in writing to create some sort of government with majority rule at first. And the point is that they had kind of already written an agreement to form some form of government. And that's important to note because they are deciding to govern themselves. And one of the big things that starts the American Revolution later on was this notion of the colonists being able to govern themselves rather than listen to what the king was saying. So even before the colonists, the Pilgrims, got off the boat, they were already agreeing to local government to govern themselves. Now, ultimately, their loyalty still had to go to the king, but if the king wasn't saying anything or Parliament in England wasn't saying anything, then they would be ruling themselves. And over the next several decades, you're going to see the colonists getting increasingly used to ruling themselves while England kind of turns largely a blind eye to what they're doing. When the king and the Parliament, much later on at the time of the American Revolution, decided they're going to kind of try to control the colonies more, you'll see resistance because they've had so much time to get used to ruling themselves. So again, in 1620, the colony of Plymouth is going to be formed after the colonists had agreed to self-government, and they are going to be led by a man named William Bradford. And ultimately, he's not going to be as big of a deal of a leader as John Winthrop is later on. Plymouth is not going to be on its own for all that long. Eventually, it's going to become part of a larger colony known as Massachusetts Bay, which is the basis for the state of Massachusetts today. Now, oftentimes, history repeats itself, and the Pilgrims are going to have problems just like the Jamestown colonists had had. The people of Plymouth, the Pilgrims, are going to suffer from a plague that's going to leave, at one point, only 50 people alive. A lot of the people that had come over on the Mayflower were not Pilgrims. They had come over for economic reasons, hoping to get to Jamestown. All of them pretty much left. The Pilgrims, feeling that they were on a sort of mission from God, stayed, despite the fact that many were dying, and in fact, at one point, less than 10 of them were even well enough to bury those that were dying. So the reason that they're going to struggle is because they cannot grow food. The growing season is very short. The winters in the northern part of the country, especially in the New England area, are notoriously cold and harsh. The soil is not very fertile, so they really weren't able to grow their own food. They really didn't know how to grow their own food. And again, history is going to kind of repeat itself here. The early English colonists are going to seek the help of local natives. In this case, they're going to seek the help from Squanto, who is from the Wampanoag tribe, and he is going to teach them how to grow food. And if you look at the picture at the bottom right, it basically shows how he did this. He did this by showing them that if they put dead fish in the ground, then the dead fish could serve as a sort of fertilizer and help grow food. And this proves to be very successful. So for those that survived and lived on to the next year, they were able to plant and they were able to have a good harvest. And ultimately, they're going to have, at the harvest time in 1621, a big feast between the English colonists, the Pilgrims, and the Wampanoags. So this shows a very positive beginning to the relationship between the colonists and the Wampanoags. It's actually the basis for what we now celebrate as Thanksgiving. However, just like what happened in Jamestown, you're going to see the same thing happen in the New England area, where eventually the English colonists and the Native Americans there are not going to get along. The more that the English are there, the more they're going to want more land, and the more that they're going to basically not be willing to compromise with the Wampanoags or other tribes. And eventually this comes to war. So yes, the Pilgrims and their descendants do go to war, and this does get very violent, surprisingly so. The Pilgrims are not always as nice as people think. So when the initial Pilgrims end up being successful, word gets out, and you do see the another wave of Puritans come over. And in 1630, you'll have a lot of non-separatist Puritans coming over. So the initial Pilgrims, remember, were separatist, and they did not want to try to purify the church from within, but pretty soon they're going to find that they are being overrun by these non-separatist Puritans that are also leaving England to escape persecution. The Puritan church was not in favor of what the Anglican church was doing, and the Anglican church was the official church of the English government, so naturally you did see some persecution. And they are going to form a much larger colony neighboring Plymouth. And again, if you look at the map on the worksheet that you have, the note sheet, you'll see where Massachusetts Bay is in relation to Plymouth. It is much bigger. And it's going to be led by someone named John Winthrop. Now, John Winthrop ends up being the major leader of this area. And Winthrop has a very strong feeling of conviction that his colony, Massachusetts Bay, is meant to basically be a Christian inspiration to the world. And he is going to say that this new Massachusetts Bay colony is going to be a city upon a hill. And he gets that language from Christian scripture that talks about this idea that a city upon a hill is going to be very visible to everybody. So basically, he's going to say what we do here in Massachusetts is going to end up being a Christian example for the entire world. Now, if you look over at the image here, you'll see the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Company. They are actually a joint stock company like Virginia had been. And if you look, if you can read sort of upside down, you can see that you have this seal saying the Native American asking for the English Puritans to, quote, come over and help us. Obviously, the Native Americans were not asking for help, and there was kind of an arrogance to the Puritans that the Native Americans were wanting help. The Native Americans have been doing fine for quite a while up to this point. They were the ones that knew how to survive in this harsh environment, and they were the ones that actually had to help. If you remember from last slide, they were the ones that actually had to help the Pilgrims survive. Now, one other thing to note about this idea of a Christian society and the city upon a hill is that the Puritans had this very strong sense that God would reward people for good behavior and punish them for bad behavior. And there was always this idea that in the Puritan communities, you had to behave and you had to make sure your neighbors were behaving, or else God might punish you. Interestingly, when the Native Americans started to die from the European disease of smallpox, a lot of people like John Winthrop would have said that was God punishing them for basically not being good Christian people. So again, word gets out about this new place for Puritans to go, and you're going to have what's known as the Great Puritan Migration. And if you look at the map, you can see that the Puritans are moving in all around the Plymouth area. Tens of thousands of them are moving in, and of course, as they move in, they're going to want more land. As they have children, and by the way, they tended to have lots of children. I'll talk more about that probably later. They're going to want even more land, and that's, of course, going to create conflict with the Native Americans who were there first. Eventually, Plymouth is going to be absorbed into Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts Bay was much bigger. It had tens of thousands of Puritans there, and Plymouth really had no real choice but to join up. So the separatists are going to have to join up with the non-separatists, and Plymouth becomes part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and no longer existed as a separate colony. Now, the people in Massachusetts are going to make a lot of money. Their main source of money is going to be through shipbuilding and then using these ships to sell different items like timber or fur and that sort of thing to other parts of the world. And you're going to see, if you look at the map here, where Boston is. So Boston is going to end up being one of the major trading port cities in the Massachusetts area. And that's important because this is the place that's seen as sort of the birth of the American Revolution. A lot of the major events that you've heard of before, like the Boston Tea Party or the Boston Massacre, obviously from their names, you know they happened in Boston. So this will end up being a big kind of birthplace of the American Revolution. Now, in Massachusetts Bay, the government was formed in what was known as the General Court. Now, technically speaking, the churches and the General Court were separate. There was supposed to be, at least on the surface, a sort of separation of church and state. The preachers did not have direct control over what people did. even though they were a very religious society. However, you did have to have certain qualifications in order to be part of the General Court, in order to be a voting member of the Massachusetts government. Now, remember that whenever I talked about the government in Virginia, you basically had to be rich, white, and male. You had to have a lot of property. You had to be a male. You had to be white. You're going to see in the Massachusetts Bay government also restrictions on who did and did not have power, although it wasn't so much based off of money as it was based off of your level of faith. Now, the General Court, the government of Massachusetts Bay, it passed lots of laws that regulated moral behavior. It said that you couldn't do this, that, and the other bad thing. You couldn't participate in immoral behavior, drunkenness, for example, sex outside of marriage, for example. Not attending church would have been a big no-no. And the reason, and as I said before, was because they believed that they had this sort of covenant or agreement with God that so long as they behaved, God would bless them with things like good weather, good health, good harvests. You're also going to see, if you look where I have the mouse right now, the idea of supporting the churches through taxes. People's tax dollars went directly towards paying for the church, which today is not even legal because today we believe in this idea of a separation of church and state. The reason for that is that if the government is supporting a certain church with taxes, then that church will have improper influence over the government, and at the same time that government might have improper influence over the churches. So the next question is, who gets to have this voting power? Who is going to be in charge of the government? And it's going to be basically people that were church members, and to be a church member, you had to have what was known as a conversion experience. Think of it in today's language, the idea of being saved. So if you wanted to become a church member, you had to be saved. You had to show that you were one of these elite Christians, if you will, and you also had to be male. I don't know anything about any kind of racial qualifications. Most of the people here would have been of European descent. They would have been white, most of them anyway. But the power was put in the hands of those that were considered kind of the leading church members. So just how Jamestown gave power to the rich, materially rich, you could say that in the New England colonies, the power was given to those that were spiritually rich and were seen as having God's favor. That being said, let me go ahead and dispel kind of a myth about the Puritans. And it's not, the idea is that the common idea is that the Puritans believed in freedom of religion, and that is not the case at all. They did not have any tolerance for people that disagreed with their religion. So when people say that the Puritans founded Plymouth or founded Massachusetts Bay on the idea of religious freedom, it's more accurate to say that they were wanting freedom of their religion. They had no tolerance for people that stood up to their idea of what proper Christianity was. And they had no tolerance for heretics. Heretics, by definition, being people that disagreed with the church. One of these famous people is going to be a man named Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams was actually a very devout Puritan. However, he did not believe in the idea that the church could force people to behave in a certain way. The church should not be mixed with the government. The church and the government should be two separate things. He didn't like the idea of government authority and church authority being hand in hand. And as a result of this, he was declared a heretic. He was said to be against the church authorities, and he was banished completely from Massachusetts. And if you look, the box that we're in now, if you follow the arrows, this box with the kind of dotted outline, it's pointing to a new colony that Roger Williams will go on to found, and that's going to be called Rhode Island. And if you'll notice, even though he himself was a devout Puritan, he founded a colony called Rhode Island that allowed for pretty much complete religious freedom. You could be one brand of Christianity or another. You could be a Puritan, you could be an Anglican, you could be a Quaker, you could be a Catholic, you could be a Jew, you could be a member of one of the Native American religions. He didn't really care. So he establishes the first colony that allowed complete freedom of religion, which of course is going to form the basis for the First Amendment to the Constitution, part of which guarantees freedom of all religions. So many of the Puritans did not believe in freedom of religion. They believed in the superiority of their religion alone, but Roger Williams is going to establish a colony where religious freedom is guaranteed to all. and the Puritans actually looked down upon him for this. One other so-called heretic is going to be a woman named Anne Hutchinson. She is going to be banished also because she challenged the religious authority of the Puritan leaders. Basically, what she's going to do is she's going to say that uh, if I am saved and I'm predestined to go to heaven, then the Puritan leaders have no authority over me because it's already been decided. And the only authority over me does not come from the Puritan leaders, it comes from God Himself. So if God says I should do something, I should do it. If the Puritan leaders don't like it, well, God takes precedent over the Puritan leaders. She's going to be banished as well, and she's going to end up during her banishment getting killed by Native Americans. And a lot of the Puritan leaders are going to say, see, this is what happens whenever you go against God's will. She had lost favor with God, and therefore God let the Native Americans kill her. That was the mindset of the Puritans. You be good, and God will reward you. You do the wrong thing, and God will punish you. This next bit will be pretty quick. It's not the most significant of parts of the lecture, but there is a little bit of noteworthiness to it related to something that happens later on. So if you look at this land above Massachusetts, you'll see that the Puritans, the members of Massachusetts Bay, are going to end up taking over some of this land. And if you look here, this, what I'm circling now, used to be part of Massachusetts. More on that in a second. Let's go to New Hampshire down here first, where I'm pointing. So New Hampshire is going to end up becoming a royal colony. Basically, the king finds out that the Puritans are taking a whole bunch of land without really asking him about it first, and so he's going to put them in their place by taking over New Hampshire and saying this is a royal colony. It's not going to be ruled by the general court. It's not going to be ruled by the Puritans. It's going to be ruled by a king-appointed governor. However, Massachusetts is allowed to maintain this part here where I'm pointing to on the map, and that part eventually will become Maine. Right now, the part that I'm circling here is considered part of Massachusetts, and the only real reason I'm mentioning it now is that in the year 1820, when the issue of slavery has become much bigger in the United States, the issue of Maine becoming a state is a big part of a major compromise that happens, and that'll happen in a later unit. Basically, Massachusetts will become a free state. Missouri will come in as a slave state, and I'll explain more of that later on in a later unit. I believe it's Unit 4. So Maine right now is part of Massachusetts for the time being. I'll speak very briefly on the final of the New England colonies. The final one that I'll speak of is going to be Connecticut, and Connecticut's going to be founded by a man named Thomas Hooker, who basically said that government power shouldn't just be in the hands of those that had church authority or had been quote-unquote saved. If you're a member of a colony, then you shouldn't have your representation in government based on your church membership. So he did want non-church members to be able to participate in government. So you already see in the New England colonies kind of this beginning of a further separation of church and state. But more importantly, more notably at least, for Connecticut, is that Connecticut is the first of the colonies to form a constitution. And this constitution is known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And I believe this is on the key terms list. So you may want to highlight this. The reason that this is important is because we need to think about what a constitution is. A constitution is a written plan of government. It's a plan that can be, because it's written down, consistent for everybody. It can be agreed upon by the people that are participating in government, and it can create a more orderly governing body. Think of it like a student handbook or a teacher handbook for a school. If you have a written down set of rules, then you can be more consistent, more fair, and governing is less according to what one leader or another likes. It's less according to their personal taste. It's according to what is written down in the rule book. And obviously in the United States, the ultimate authority when it comes to laws in the United States is not a certain state. It's not a certain member of the federal government. It's not the president. It is the Constitution. So one of the biggest deals that comes out of Connecticut is the fact that you have your first ever written constitution, written rule book on how to govern a colony. And obviously later on we'll talk about the Constitution of the United States. So that's a pretty big deal. Notice that the caption here, as you flip onto the back side of the notes, it says war with the Indians or Native Americans again. So history is going to again repeat itself. The colonies that I've finished discussing, the ones that are shown in the map on the front side of these notes, they're going to be known eventually as New England. So you have a New Spain, you have a New France, now you have a New England, even though the Chesapeake colonies, for whatever reason, weren't considered to be part of New England. And eventually, initially, the Native Americans, the Wampanoag, and the New Englanders are going to get along just fine because they're going to trade. If you look at the image on the right, you can see that they are gathered together peacefully, probably engineering some sort of trading deal. So again, initially they're going to get along. However, there's going to be a couple reasons why they don't get along over time. Number one is that the Puritans overall, except for maybe in Rhode Island and that being about it, most New Englanders are Puritans, and they are not going to be very tolerant of Native American religions, and at the same time they're also going to want their land. So a lot of the New Englanders, the Puritans, are going to say, well, we've been doing what God wants, God has blessed us, and so we should have more land, and the Native Americans aren't doing what God wants, and so we can take their land. And the Wampanoags were not really willing to adopt the English religion, their customs, their laws. And so what you'll end up seeing happening is that the New Englanders are going to start taking land from the Wampanoags and other Native American groups by force. And a lot of this they'll do with the justification that God is on their side. In fact, they do get criticized by the English government for how they're treating the Native Americans and taking their land away. And so to try to make up for it in a very half-hearted effort, they're going to start setting up what are known as praying towns, where they basically put all the Native Americans in one area where they can convert them to Christianity and then, quote unquote, teach them how to be good Christians. And these praying towns where they isolate the Native Americans into certain areas where they can be controlled really foreshadows the idea of Native American reservations that you've probably heard of and will get talked about probably at the very end of this course, and definitely in American history too. So again, you see the seeds for certain trends being planted here. The idea that the English don't want to coexist with the Native Americans, they don't want to share land with the Native Americans, and eventually want to get Native Americans out of the way by putting them in isolated areas, whether it be praying towns in the 1600s or in the 1800s on Native American reservations. Obviously, this will raise tension, and eventually you will see some wars break out. And there are going to be multiple wars. King Philip's War was not the first war that was fought between the Native Americans and the New Englanders, but it is going to be the last final one, and it is going to be a pretty major effort from the Native Americans. So the Native Americans are going to eventually get sick of the fact that they are dying of things like smallpox. They're going to get sick of the fact that the New Englanders are taking their land and trying to force religion upon them. And then you have the outbreak of what's known as King Philip's War. King Philip was a name given to a Wampanoag leader. His real name would have been Metacom or Metacomet, but the New Englanders called him King Philip. And this uprising of Native Americans is actually extremely violent and for a while extremely successful. If you look at the map here, and it says here English settlements attacked, you can see how many of the Native Americans were successful in attacking so many of the English towns. In fact, they pretty much drove the Puritans all the way back to Boston. But eventually, the English diseases are going to set in even more, and eventually they are going to successfully fight back, and they are going to eventually kill King Philip and destroy many Native American villages in the process. And remember, these are the Puritans. These are the people that we always think of as the Pilgrims, or being like the Pilgrims. Being very religious and being very peaceful and very into the idea of freedom of religion. They treated the Native Americans poorly, just like the people of Jamestown did in the Powhatan Wars, and they are going to burn down Native American villages. There are quotes from some of these Puritan leaders where they talk happily about how many souls they sent to hell that day as they killed Native Americans. King Philip himself is going to be basically pulled into separate pieces, and his body is going to be put on a stake, almost like a scarecrow or a warning to any future Native Americans trying to resist the English. And so the big deal about King Philip's War, the big significance of it, is that it's going to represent the last major stand of the Native Americans against the New Englanders. In the end, the English are going to dominate New England, and the Native Americans are going to be driven out, just like what happened in the Virginia area and the Chesapeake area further south. So history repeats itself. The Puritans were not really, in the end, any nicer to the Native Americans, even though they were supposed to be the so-called good Christian people. In the end, they take land from Native Americans. They are not tolerant of Native Americans, and they take over, just like you saw in the Chesapeake region in Virginia and Maryland. If you look at this chart here, for example, you can see the white population is going to go up and the Native American population is going to decline, partly because of disease, partly because of war. You'll notice that there is a small black population. Interestingly, slavery was allowed in all 13 colonies at one point. Not nearly as much in the northern areas, though, and after the American Revolution, many of the northern states are going to get rid of slavery either gradually or entirely. And I'll talk much more about this issue of slavery in the United States in later lectures. It is a major deal, and it will be a major reason that the Civil War occurs, but we'll get to that when the time comes. Now, another country is going to decide to try to settle in the New World, and they're going to settle. If you look at the map, they're going to come in right through here and settle what becomes New York. So if you look at the chart here, the map, you'll see that there is a box pointing to New York. Let's get to the middle colonies. I'll focus a whole lot more on Pennsylvania than I will New York, but I will start with New York. So the Dutch are going to settle pretty much right in the area between the New England colonies and the Chesapeake colonies. Why are they there? What are they doing? Well, there's a man named Henry Hudson, and Henry Hudson is going to basically be doing the same thing that Columbus was doing, trying to find a water route to India and China, basically East Asia. And if you look at the map here, he's going to try to find this route going up what becomes the Hudson River, named after him. And after a while, they kind of realize that this route's not going to go anywhere, and it basically just spits them back out to the Atlantic Ocean. So what does Henry Hudson have to show for his efforts? Well, he's going to claim an area for the Dutch, again, people from the Netherlands, and this area is going to be right here where I'm putting the mouse, and that's going to become known as New Netherland. The main settlement in New Netherland is going to be known as New Amsterdam, and New Amsterdam would be mapped out right here. This, in the future, is going to become New York City. And there's a famous story about how the Native Americans that lived there were basically duped into giving up this land, which proved to be incredibly valuable by today's standards. And they basically gave up that land for very little in return for, I think, maybe $20-something worth of trinkets, something very invaluable. And they did this on the misunderstanding that they were being paid money not to give up this land, but to share it. So they end up getting kind of conned out of this land. The Dutch are going to take it from them, and they're going to create a major port city known as New Amsterdam to protect against Native American attacks, because the Native Americans obviously weren't too happy. If you look at the map here, you'll see a fortified wall, and that today is where Wall Street is in New York City. Now let's remember that the main people that are settling on the east coast of the New World, of the Americas, were the English. Why were the English allowing this to happen? Well, the English were basically distracted. So if you look at the map here, again, you can see how the Dutch are settling right smack in between the Chesapeake colonies down here and the New England colonies up here. The reason that England allows this is because they're distracted. What are they distracted by? Themselves. Basically, during this time, England had fallen into a civil war, and they took their focus off of the New World while they were basically fixing their own problems. And as soon as this English Civil War concluded, which I will not get into since this is an American history class and not so much a world history class, following the English Civil War, England is going to focus back on the New World, and they are going to be very unhappy with what the Dutch are doing. England, remember, has a much superior navy than they had before they brought down the Spanish Armada. Now the Spanish Armada are gone. England is basically one of the powerhouses when it comes to navy, and they are going to roll into New Amsterdam. They're going to roll up to New Netherland, and they're going to take them from the Dutch pretty easily with virtually no fight. And New Netherland gets renamed New York, and New Amsterdam becomes New York City, names that we are familiar with today. New York is going to be, like Boston, one of the major trading areas in the country. Today, both Boston and New York City are major hubs of trade, are very wealthy cities. When the American Revolution occurs, you will see first the English going after Boston. The English military will go after Boston to try to stop the rebellion. They're going to go after New York City to stop the rebellion. And eventually also they'll go to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. More on that when we get to the fighting of the American Revolution itself. Now on to Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is kind of a funny story. And again, if you look at the map there, you'll see where I'm pointing with the dotted lines. It's going to be founded by a religious group known as the Quakers. And the Quakers were different than a lot of the other groups. They did have strong elements of Christianity within their beliefs. They also had some elements within their beliefs that were pretty unique to them, especially for their time. One thing that's very noteworthy about the Quakers is that they were the most tolerant group of any of the groups from England that we'll talk about. Officially, they're known as the Society of Friends, but we'll call them the Quakers. That's the more common name for them. And the Quakers are going to be known for being pacifists, which means that they are nonviolent. They don't believe in fighting at all. And they also believe in total religious toleration. So even though they believed in their own religion, they were Quakers, that was their religion, they believed in the freedom of others to worship as they saw fit. And it's kind of interesting because sometimes Quakers would send missionaries to up north to Puritan areas, and then they would get basically run out of town by the Puritans. However, the Quakers were very welcoming of people of other religions, even Native American religions. So again, you're going to see this idea of religious toleration. But furthermore, and this is what makes the Quakers special and very much like in line with a lot of American values today, is that they also believed far more in equality than most people did. They basically believe that everyone has this sort of inner light. Think of it as a soul. And if you have a soul, that makes you a human. And if you are a human, then you're equal. It does not matter your sex, male or female. It does not matter your race, black, white, or any other. They believe that all people were equal, which is a value that Americans hold much more dearly today than they did back during the colonial period. So they much more believed in equality than any other group, and that is definitely worth noting because that lays the seeds for this idea of all people being created equally. And the Quakers are way ahead of their time in this belief. So where do the Quakers settle? Well, they settle in an area that's known as Pennsylvania. And it's kind of a funny story about how Pennsylvania comes to be. Basically, there's a Quaker named William Penn, and his dad had been basically a gambling buddy of the King of England, and the King of England had actually not been as good at playing cards as William Penn's dad. And so the king owed a lot of gambling debt to the Penn family. So to pay off the debt, he told William Penn, guess what? You can have Pennsylvania. And this is a major piece of land, named after, as you can tell, William Penn. So Pennsylvania is going to be a place where Quakers could practice their religion freely. Like the Puritans in England, like the Catholics in England, the Quakers also faced persecution in England, so this becomes kind of a safe refuge for them. So it allows for complete religious freedom. There is a lot of political freedom as well. Basically, this is the freest area in the New World among the English colonies. And Philadelphia will be the capital. Philadelphia is going to be a huge deal later on because it's going to be in Philadelphia that the Declaration of Independence will ultimately be written because of things going on in Boston largely, but it'll be written in Philadelphia. Philadelphia will also be the location where the Constitution of the United States is eventually written and signed. So that'll be a big deal later on in this class. Now, what's interesting to note is that the Pennsylvanians were very respectful, like I said, of all people, even Native Americans. They were peaceful with the Native Americans. They, if they wanted land from the Native Americans, they would buy it from them, and they would buy it from them at a fair price. They would treat them equally. The two groups respected each other so much that they even babysat each other's children. There is going to be a problem, though, and the problem is that the Pennsylvanians, the Quakers, are in a sense almost too welcoming, and they start sending out these letters and advertisements back to Europe saying, hey, if you want to come to a place where you are allowed to be whoever you want to be, come to Pennsylvania. And what ends up happening is that many people that are not Quakers come to Pennsylvania. Many people that do not believe in equality, many people that don't want to treat Native Americans well, and ultimately Pennsylvania is going to end up being not that friendly to Native Americans. Slavery is going to take hold in Pennsylvania for a while, not by the Quakers. The Quakers did not believe in slavery. However, basically the colony they had started, the Quakers had started, was now being overrun by non-Quakers that did not believe in equality and that did not believe in treating the Native Americans fairly. Before I move on, let's keep in mind, though, that the initial founding of Pennsylvania was done by Quakers, and that the Quakers believed in equality of all people, regardless of race, regardless of sex, regardless of religion, and those are core American values that people respect today, and a lot of that is seen in your Constitution, especially the First Amendment, which guarantees lots of freedom of expression and religion. Moving on. We'll conclude now by talking about the southern colonies basically below the ones that you see here. So right now you see the New England colonies here. You see the middle colonies here. I haven't talked about all of them, and that's okay. Some of them are not all that significant in terms of how they impact the future of the country and the settlement and the creation of the United States. And then you see the Chesapeake colonies here. Well, what about the colonies further down? Well, I'll get to that now. So let's talk about the Carolinas. Initially, Carolina was all one colony. It was given to 8 different people that were close with the king, and so this will be a privately owned colony, and it will be therefore known as a proprietary colony. However, the two Carolinas are going to end up developing pretty differently. If you want to be a wealthy colony, you basically have to have a good place to put port cities. Like in New York, you had New York City. In Massachusetts, you had Boston. Well, if you look at the map here, there's plenty of good coastline along South Carolina, a good place to put what became Charleston. But along North Carolina, you've got the Outer Banks. If you've ever been to the beaches of North Carolina, you know that there are sandbars outside of the Outer Banks. It's known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. So if there's money to be made in Carolina, it's not going to be in the northern part of Carolina where ships have a harder time getting in and out. It's going to be in the southern part of Carolina, especially at Charlestown, named for King Charles. Eventually, it'll become known as Charleston. So South Carolina is going to end up becoming the richer, wealthier part of the Carolina colony. It has good harbors. It's going to have a very wealthy port city, Charlestown. And one of the things that's going to really flourish here, now that we're back south at a place that has fertile soil where tobacco could be grown a lot, you're going to see the slave trade get really big in Charlestown or Charleston. At this point, slaves are still being brought in from other places, either directly from Africa or from the Caribbean islands. Either way, they originated from Africa. Sometimes they came directly from Africa. Sometimes they went from Africa to the Caribbean islands and then to mainland English colonies. And I'll talk more about that later on. But in the end, the southern part becomes richer, and they do eventually divide North and South Carolina. North Carolina, however, is going to be a place that's not so wealthy. There aren't going to be as many slave owners in North Carolina because people basically couldn't afford slaves as much in North Carolina. If you were a wealthy person, you were either in Virginia, which had places like Jamestown and other port towns, or you were in South Carolina, which had Charlestown, modern-day Charleston. The people that didn't really make it in terms of being really wealthy, kind of your outsiders, the people that were kind of maybe more social outcasts or economic outcasts because they were poor in either Carolina or Virginia, they found a safe haven in the northern part of Carolina. And so the northern part of Carolina becomes the place for the less wealthy, for the outcast, and honestly for those that were more free thinkers. For example, if you were in Virginia or if you were in Carolina, you came there for money reasons. You did not come there for religious reasons, so you had strong ties to the Anglican Church. If you didn't like the Anglican Church, or maybe if you were in Maryland and you didn't like the Catholic Church, you oftentimes went to North Carolina, and that's a place where people, again, that weren't really on the in crowd might go and move to. A poorer area, but a more free thinking, more independent area than either Virginia or South Carolina. Now I have one final colony to discuss, and that will be the colony of Georgia. So the problem that the English colonies had was that the Spanish owned Florida, and Florida was right next or very close to South Carolina. And that presented a danger, especially because South Carolina ends up being probably one of the richest colonies early on because of Charleston or Charlestown. And so the English really wanted to kind of protect South Carolina from Spanish Florida. So they basically create a buffer zone, which you see here is the last of the colonies to form, and that will be Georgia. So if we're going to create this colony, Georgia, who are we going to put there? The English are going to use this as a place to put some of the poorest people in England. People that were so poor that they were in debt. At this time in the history of the world, there was a such thing as debtor's prison, where if you couldn't pay your debt, you actually would be put in prison for it. Now, how you're supposed to pay your debt while in prison, I don't know, but there was a such thing as debtor's prison. And one of the people in England had had a dear friend die in debtor's prison. These were not pleasant places. And he asked the king if he could start a colony. His name was James Oglethorpe. He gets permission and he creates Georgia. Now, what's interesting is that Georgia is going to initially ban slavery and it's going to ban alcohol. Eventually, those two bans are going to go away and both will be allowed. But it is interesting to note because as we go forward in this class, you will see some movements that start to say that slavery is evil and needs to be gotten rid of. That'll be the abolitionist movement. And alcohol is an evil, or at least alcohol abuse is an evil and needs to be gotten rid of. And you'll see movements against that as well. Ironically, the anti-slavery and anti-alcohol movements are going to take place in the northern states, not in the southern states moving forward. Finally, let's talk about the main purpose of Georgia, and the main purpose of Georgia was to be nothing much more than a buffer zone between the wealthy South Carolina and Florida, which again was owned by Spain at this point. So that's the main thing to know about Georgia, was that it was a buffer colony. Now, I know I haven't talked about every single one of the original 13 colonies, but I have talked about the ones that were most significant in terms of how they kind of set the stage for the eventual American Revolution, the eventual writing of the Declaration of Independence, the eventual writing of the Constitution of the United States of America. I did leave out things about Delaware. I did leave out things about New Jersey. There wasn't a whole lot that I had to say about them, but that does round out your 13 colonies. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk more about how people lived in each of these regions, especially in the New England region versus the southern region. And they lived very different lifestyles, and those differences will continue whenever the United States becomes the United States, and eventually will actually play into the coming of the Civil War.